Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome you today. The title of our webinar is The Independence of the Judicial System Under Threat in Tunisia. My pleasure to welcome you. In light of the coup against democracy and against the constitution. The topic is extremely important and timely because, as you know, President Qais Said has announced recently, last weekend, on Saturday at midnight, that he will be issuing a decree to shut down the Supreme Judicial Council, which is a body elected by the judges to govern the judicial system in Tunisia under the constitution. And that Qais Said also announced today, in fact, this morning, that he is issuing a new law by decree to govern the council, the Judicial Council, and to replace the council with a new council appointed by himself, by the president. These are very dangerous and ominous developments for two reasons, in my opinion. First of all, the president does not have the right under the law or under the constitution of Tunisia to do this. So the president is clearly acting outside of the law and outside of the constitution when he made these announcements. And secondly, this is very dangerous for the future of democracy in Tunisia, because as we all know, separation of powers and checks and balances are very important pillars of the democracy. And if the president can control all the three branches of the government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, then we can't really talk about democracy anymore. It will be the end of democracy in Tunisia, and that will be also terrible not only for Tunisia but for the entire Middle East and North Africa region. So we have three excellent panelists today. I will not waste time by reading their bios, but we sent you their bios by email. We have Mr. Said bin Arbiya. He's the Director of Middle East and North Africa at the International Commission of Jurists. We have Mr. Abdelrazak Kilani, former Minister and Ambassador to the UN Human Rights Commission and former President of the Tunisian Lawyers Association. And we also have and welcome Monica Marks. She's Assistant Professor of Middle East Politics at New York University in Abu Dhabi and the leading expert on Tunisia's post-revolutionary politics. So before we begin, just two very quick reminders. We have bilingual interpretation available today in English and Arabic. So you can choose the language you want to hear under interpretation. You click on the button at the bottom of the screen and you can choose which language you want to hear, either English or Arabic or both. Also, each panelist will give a presentation of roughly 15 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you have a question, you can ask a question by three ways. The first way is by raising your hand, and then we will come to you and you can ask your question by voice or by video. Number two, you can ask the question in the chat area. You can click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen and you can ask your question, which will be seen by all the participants. And number three, you can ask the question in the Q&A function by pushing the Q&A button, and those questions will go directly to the panelists and to the moderator. You can choose which panelist you want to respond. So with that, let us begin, and we start today with Mr. Said bin Arbiya. As I said, he is the Director of Middle East and North Africa at the International Commission of Jurists, ICJ. Mr. Said, thank you very much for joining us today. And please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Radwan, for the introduction and for the opportunity. This land attacks on the rule of law in Tunisia. Let me just start by explaining what's the Higher Judicial Council, what's the role of the Higher Judicial Council. Higher Judicial Council by the 2014 Constitution with two major mandates. One is to manage the career of judges, to ensure that the criteria and the procedures related to the appointment, promotion, transfer, disciplining of judges and prosecutors are conducted consistent with well-established criteria and in a way that preserves the independence of the judiciary. So managing the career of judges and also ensuring the institutional independence of the judiciary, ensuring that laws, policies, practices by the parliament, by the government are developed and implemented in a way that protects the independence.
ويحرص على أن القوانين التي تسن تكون حافظة لاستقلال هؤلاء القضاة.
You can hear the translation. فأعتقد أن the two elements, ensuring the individual independence of judges and ensuring the institutional independence of the judiciary are the core elements or the core functions of the higher judicial council. And because of the importance of these functions, government in general tends to attempt to take control over the higher judicial council. In the history of Tunisia and also in the history of other countries in the region, higher judicial council was presided over by the president,
يتأسف الرئيس في بعض الدول الأخرى ونائب الرئيس أيضا.
His intention to apply the Article 80 of the Constitution and to declare the state of exception. He also declared himself to be a chief prosecutor. That declaration was not reflected in the decree itself, and it wasn't reflected in the decree because the higher judicial council at the time opposed such a declaration, reminded the president that the office of public prosecutor is part of the judiciary, it's independent, and it cannot be under the control of influence or the direct control of the president. And that was the beginning of the conflict, or at least after the 25th of July, that was the first instance of open, direct confrontation between the higher judicial council and between the president. What followed after that was a series of episodes that the president deemed to be inadequate or inappropriate for an institution that he considers to be, I think he considers the whole judiciary to be just, the judges are civil servants, that the judiciary is just functioned amongst the functions of the state, and that the judiciary is not an equal branch to the parliament or to the government. That's the general position of the president. And there were also instances in which the president declared, for example, by decree that he would suspend the financial allowances and other privileges of the members. The higher judicial council reacted that they will continue to do their work anyway. And because the higher judicial council said no to the president on numerous occasions, the president went ahead and dissolved or announced that he is dissolving the higher judicial council. Why this declaration is problematic? One is that the constitution itself does not even contemplate the idea of the higher judicial council being dissolved. Under the constitution, the president can dissolve the parliament, for example. This is a constitutional procedure provided for by the constitution. And the president has all power and authority actually to dissolve the parliament if he wishes so. And that was something provided for by the constitution. But the president cannot, not president or the authorities, there is no constitutional mechanism, procedure, criteria for dissolving the higher judicial council. Because when the drafter of the constitution thought about the higher judicial council or thought about the judiciary, they were thinking about it as an equal branch of government, as an institution that should be independent in law and in practice. And the only way to dissolve the higher judicial council basically is to do it through a constitutional amendment. So none of these conditions or none of these criteria are there when it comes to the decision of the president to dissolve the higher judicial council. He decided that it's going to be done through decree, which is unconstitutional, which has no legal basis, no constitutional basis, and which is counter to the basic principles of the rule of law, and which ends effectively in a semblance of separation of power. Now, the president over the past 6 or 7 months was engaged in a campaign of delegitimizing the higher judicial council and the judiciary broadly. And the accusations were basically about the judiciary being a corrupt institution. In the beginning, it started just with some judges are corrupt, but with time, those some judges became the majority, and the accusations started being directed at institutions rather than individuals. So let's unpack a little bit the accusation of corruption that the president leveled against the High Judicial Council. When the president was in the Ministry of Interior and declared that the High Judicial Council is to be dissolved, he mentioned that some members of the High Judicial Council were receiving bribes and money from members to ensure appointments and promotion. And that's something that is just part of the smear campaign that the president was leveraging against, or was leveling against, the High Judicial Council. There is no basis, no evidence that the members of the High Judicial Council were involved or have been involved in such misconduct, and to think that 45 members of the High Judicial Council are receiving bribes to appoint this judge in such a jurisdiction, or promoting or transferring a judge to another jurisdiction, doesn't make such sense. There is another criticism, which I think can be valid or should be looked at in a more detailed way, is that there are delays in terms of dealing with certain cases or specific cases. And I think they were basically talking about 2 cases of former political opposition leaders who were assassinated, and that there were delays in terms of the investigation. I think the prolonged procedures within the justice system is a common problem, not related to 1 or 2 cases. It's something that all cases, all jurisdictions are dealing with. And the delays are related to the complicated procedures that exist within the legal system, but it's also related to the complex and sometimes conflictual nature and the relationship between the various actors of the criminal justice system. So when we say that there are delays in terms of the investigations are conducted by police or by security forces that are effectively under the control of the Ministry of Interior, that are effectively under the control of the executive branch and therefore the president. And if there are delays at that level, that's not the responsibility of the High Judicial Council. We were also asking, or the president and supporters were also asking the Higher Judicial Council to intervene in individual cases. And it's important to highlight, from a rule of law perspective, separation of power perspective, judicial independence perspective, that the Higher Judicial Council cannot and does not have any jurisdiction or any powers to intervene in individual cases. And that's just the rule of law way, that you cannot, as an institution, intervene in individual cases or direct a judge or prosecutor to deal with the case one way or another. And if the Higher Judicial Council is to do so, then it would be an attempt, it would be an attack against the individual independence of judges, and us as organizations, civil society or bar associations or other stakeholders would be rightly so actually criticizing the Higher Judicial Council for such interventions. So to unpack, the reasons provided for by the president to dissolve the Higher Judicial Council are not valid. The procedure for dissolving the Higher Judicial Council is not based on the Constitution, is not based on the law, and and because I think it's important to highlight this point, is that the president is dissolving the Higher Judicial Council through decree. Even when such decree is published, such decree would be null and void and of no legal effect, because it has no legal or constitutional basis. However, the practice in Tunisia right now, since over the past 6 or 7 months, is that the president decides and armed and security forces give effect to such decisions. So de facto now we are having a situation that the lawlessness in the country is at a level that even the most blatantly unconstitutional, illegal decrees are being enforced and are being implemented. And we witnessed that in specific cases of parliament, when you had armed forces preventing the elected members of the parliament who are representing the will of people from carrying out their functions. And we witnessed that just 2 days ago with the police preventing elected members of the Higher Judicial Council, the representative of constitutional institutions, to carry out their function. Moving forward, the president right now today, is talking about appointing a new Higher Judicial Council, a decree that would establish a new Higher Judicial Council. I think it goes to the heart of the question of the rule of law in Tunisia. Until the 25th of July, Tunisia was a country of institutions and of laws and of a constitution that is the primary source of legislation. After the 25th of July, we are in a situation in which the country is a country that is ruled by one man through decrees that lack any constitutional or legal basis, but that then these decrees are having or being implemented or enforced by security and armed forces. And when it comes to the judiciary and the independence of the judiciary, it is important to highlight that any new body to be established, that body would lack the legitimacy that is provided for by the Constitution, and that we have to be careful about the composition, about the mandate of such bodies. And I will just finish, mindful of the time, by highlighting that the Constitution of 2014 and the revolution provided for numerous institutions that have the potential, if they've been implemented correctly, to establish the rule of law in the country. And the architecture, institutional architecture was not completed because there are numerous pieces of legislation and laws that are impacting the judiciary that were not adopted over the past 10 years. The law governing the judiciary right now is the Law 67. That's from the time of Coup. And that law does not guarantee the security of tenure of judges. Judges are considered to be a civil servant, and if you are having a new body or new institution that gives oversight over the judiciary to the executive branch, we will see a situation in which judges will be dismissed, judges will be subject to disciplinary proceedings just because they are unwilling to comply with whatever the government are willing. And that would be the end of the rule of law. We are in a situation in which the Tunisian democracy is in an existential crisis. Through such initiatives by the president, we are dismantling, the president is systematically dismantling the very last institutions that can maintain some semblance of rule of law and separation of power in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saeed. This was a really excellent presentation and a very good summary of where the situation is right now. We now go to Mr. Abdelrazak Al-Kilani. Mr. Abdelrazak, please go ahead. You have the floor and you have about 15 minutes, please.
أهلا وسهلا سي رضوان.
مرحبا بك سي عبدالرزاق.
I greet you. I did not hear the introduction, your introduction. I do not know how I will start or end in this contribution, but the question is, in my speech, is that the dissolution of the Supreme Judicial Council is a culmination of trying to control the judiciary. I want to go back. Before the revolution, the judiciary, as you know, was under the control of a council, a Supreme Judicial Council, appointed, headed by the president, and his deputy was the justice minister, and the council, even in its elected part, was under the control of the executive power, since there was what was called the judges of the executive, who controlled the elections and the election of members of the Judicial Council. The executive, as we know, was in control of the judiciary, and during crises there were attempts by judges in '85 to regain their independence and to get rid of the domination of the executive, but this attempt was aborted through through referring some judges to disciplinary councils or dismissing them. Then in 2001, there was the letter by the well-known judge, the late Mukhtar Yahyawi. He sent an open letter in July 2001 to the President of the Republic at the time, who was toppled later, Zine al-Abidine bin Ali, in which he exposed the extent of the interference of the executive in the judiciary and the extent of the danger. And everyone knows how Judge Yahyawi was subjected to restrictions and harassment and to repression, which led to being referred to disciplinary proceedings in December 2001. Since that time, in 2001 to 2005, we witnessed what was known as the movement of the Association of Tunisian Judges. This movement, which expressed at the time the anger, which expressed the condemnation of the interference of the president in the court on the occasion of the case of the opposition politician Mr. Mohamed Abou. And of course, following that statement by the Judges Association, the executive moved to interfere in the election of the Association of Judges and imposed judges that were allied with it. And of course, after the revolution, the judiciary began to regain its independence and its healthy functioning until we reached the Constitution of 27th of January 2014. This Constitution that established the judiciary as an independent authority. And thanks to that Constitution, Tunisia enjoyed a democratic system, an advanced system based on the separation of powers, the executive, legislative, and judiciary. And the Supreme Judicial Council occupies the principal position in the judiciary as the council that ensures the independence of the judiciary and the good functioning of the judiciary, and also ensures the disciplining of judges and the professional progression of the professional careers of judges. And it was this constitution recognized that the judiciary is an authority that guarantees the proper implementation of the law and also protects rights and freedoms. The question today is we have this authority, the head of the Coup authority is undermining the judiciary through this dramatic move, which he announced, dramatic because he announced it after midnight when Tunisians were asleep, and he announced it also from a place that symbolizes repression. And yes, indeed, it symbolizes the protection of the law, but also symbolizes the police that for Tunisians, for Tunisian citizens, for a certain period had been responsible for their repression. And of course, the Supreme Judicial Council moved after the closure of its headquarters, also in a dramatic and shocking manner. The police closed the headquarters and then left because they did not want the identity of those officers to be revealed, and even when the Interior Ministry was asked, the Judicial Council President asked the Interior Ministry how they could close the headquarters, and no one was able to answer who had given the order to close the headquarters of the Supreme Judicial Council. What we have witnessed in the last few weeks really is a tragedy. It is a setback for the revolution that, as I said, has brought us a constitution, this constitution that guarantees rights and freedoms, the constitution that stipulates the universal principles of rights and freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom of protest and expression and association, etc. This constitution today has been suspended by the head of the Coup authority, and what makes matters worse is that after taking control of the executive as a whole and also the legislative as a whole today, he is usurping or seeks or attempts to, because we do not know what the current situation is, he is attempting to usurp judicial authority. Yesterday we heard the Justice Minister who declared that the President did not dissolve the Judicial Council, but today we are surprised that the President himself, the head of the Coup authority, came out to say that he has decided to dissolve the Supreme Judicial Council and replace it with some other body. We have a statement from the executive of the Supreme Judicial Council which rejects this decision and rejects the body that would replace it, because it is an elected body, an elected authority, and what the President has done violates the law. In Tunisia, we are living in under the law of the jungle, because the decision taken by the head of the Coup authority is not based on any legal basis or constitutional basis. Even Article 80 of the Constitution related to exceptional measures does not stipulate the dissolution of the Supreme Judicial Council, and today he is governing through decrees, and the President, who through his decree of September 2021, decree number 117, today he is ruling through decrees, and he wants to use decrees to form a new judicial council in the way he wishes. And of course, today all the actions being made by the head of the Coup authority are invalid, because Article 70 of the Constitution does not allow him to govern through decrees, because this article does not accept when Parliament is dissolved. And everyone knows that the Assembly, Parliament, is only frozen. Legally, it still exists, although it is frozen as a result of the decision of the head of the Coup authority on the 26th of July. Today, in reality, we live under a very dangerous situation. All experts of law, particularly constitutional law, do not know how they would teach this subject at university, because everyone knows that Article 80 does not stipulate the dissolution nor freezing of Parliament, but rather says that Parliament should remain in a state of permanent session. This article does not allow for the dismissal of the government, whereas the head of the Coup has dismissed the government. Also, this situation is, in fact, has led to the concern, in addition to concerns inside Tunisia, everyone knows that most, if not all, political parties, most human rights organizations and organizations of civil society condemn what the head of the coup has done and do not accept it. There is resistance that is growing through citizens against the coup and through the movements of many parties and associations that are active in civil society. Also abroad, we have seen the reactions of even the Secretary General of the United Nations through his spokesperson, who expressed the Secretary General's concern over the decisions made by the President and undermining the Supreme Judicial Council as the foundation for rights and freedoms and the foundation for a state based on the rule of law and institutions and the foundation or one of the pillars of democracy. Also, the Human Rights Commission expressed concern and fear that the Tunisian government is foregoing its commitment to international treaties. As you know, Tunisia has ratified the international treaty on rights and freedoms, which requires countries to protect rights and freedoms. And the Human Rights Commissioner expressed fear that these decisions undermine the foundations of democracy in Tunisia and the foundations of human rights, which Tunisia had ratified. We all know that the Constitution stipulates that the international treaties are above national laws and decrees. So Tunisia today is in a situation that violates completely international commitments and treaties, and what we fear is that there might be sanctions against this regime and against the Tunisian state. And of course, we as law experts and as lawyers, we will stand, we will resist against this situation. We will be faithful to the blood of the martyrs, because the independence of the judiciary is part of the Constitution of Tunisia of 27th of January 2014, which came through the sacrifices, thanks to the sacrifices of men and women of Tunisia who sacrificed daily so that we live free in this country. And we must resist this coup. Of course, we rely on peaceful resistance. We do not have any police or army. We also depend on the institutions of the state, which, whether it's the police or the army, to be part of this struggle. We are in a struggle against someone who has abrogated the institutions of the state. The Constitution states that the security forces should be Republican and the army should be Republican, and they should be neutral. They should be neutral. That is, they should stand, these institutions should stand equally. They should not be biased, whether it is to the opposition or the rulers. This is the situation of Tunisia today. Tunisia, which was called in the West the Jasmine Revolution. There are external forces that that were not pleased, that were not happy with the achievements of the Tunisian people through their revolution, the Tunisian people who gained their freedom. These forces wish to abort this experience, this Tunisian experience, so that it does not expand or reach its neighbors or through the Arab world. And of course, we condemn any interference, and we all know that there are Gulf countries that are interfering in our country in order to lead this pioneering model to fail. Yes, there have been difficulties and obstacles over the last 10 years, but in all of those, but we should always take lessons from the difficulties we faced, and Tunisians are conscious that there were things that were not working well. There are reforms that must be introduced in the judiciary. Yes, the judiciary does need reforms, but there must be political will. And I say that the head of the Coup authority who rules today, for more than 2.5 years, he has been ruling, and in each media appearance and in each of his speeches in which he addresses the people, he talks about the judges and the judiciary in using the words treatment of corruption and other labels. There are some exceptional cases, but the judiciary as a whole is not so. There must be reforms in relation to the infrastructure, in terms of the conditions of the courts, the working conditions of judges. In some courts, you may not even find restrooms. There are cases, accumulated files and cases in one day. A judge could look at 300 to 400 files. Reforms should be introduced to give the judiciary the status it needs, the budget it needs, because justice and the judiciary are the foundation of civilization. We hope that the political class and the Tunisian people as a whole take lessons from this crisis. The coup is surely going to fall. The Tunisian people are free, and they will not accept to submit to a new dictatorship after having experienced the bitter experience of dictatorship in the past.
شكرا ليك سي عبد الرزاق. جست حبيت نذكرك، ربما ما سمعتنيش في الأول، إنه إذا تحب تسمع الترجمة.
I wanted to remind you that if you want to hear instant interpretation from English to Arabic or Arabic to English, you can press the correct button at the bottom of the screen.
لا، في اللوطة في الإكران ثم interpretation تختار فيها اللغة English Arabic، تختار اللغة اللي تحب تسمع بها في الإكران. ما نعرفش بالضبط في التليفون كنتي وين، لكن موجودة ثم قرص الاختيار اللغة التي تريد السماع بها. Okay, so now we go to our third speaker and third panelist, Professor Monica Marks. Welcome, good to see you again. You were in Tunis very recently, so please give us a very brief summary of what you found during your visit, and try to link it with this topic today of the independence of the judicial system. So thank you, Monica, you have the floor.
Absolutely. I'll try to be brief because there are many in the audience with just an incredible wealth of expertise and decades worth of knowledge about Tunisia, and it would be wonderful to have some Q&A. It's a real honor to speak alongside Saeed Ben Arabia and Abdelrazak Kilani. I can't think of a better expert on Tunisia's judiciary than Saeed, and I highly encourage everybody in the audience to read ICJ's work if they haven't done so already, to understand all the nitty-gritty details about the ins and outs of Tunisia's judiciary. I also think it might be worth noting, just in case some in the audience aren't aware, Abdulrazak Kilani himself, who's the former head of Tunisia's Bar Association, a recipient of the Paris Bar Association's Human Rights Award for his efforts to defend human rights during Tunisia's 2011 revolution, he himself is under bogus investigations, summons, from Tunisia's military courts, even though he's a civilian, after having attended the January 14th demonstration in Tunis, commemorating the 2011 revolution, and after simply trying to visit his client, one of his clients, Noureddin Bihiri, who is vice president of NAFTA, and who was violently abducted from his home on December 31st and has been held without any arrest warrant, any formal charges, no access to due process or his attorneys since then. So we're speaking, in a very fraught context. I also think it's worth noting that there are many in Tunisia who have been so dissatisfied with the past 10 years and also so touched by various conspiracy theories, some of which are decades old and involve decades old ideological pathologies about so-called Islamists in Tunisia. Some who would denounce us, these three independent experts speaking with you here tonight, simply because Radwan is a member of Anafa, or simply because Abdulrazak Kilani, an independent lawyer with a storied human rights history, is defending a member of Anafa. We're in a very fraught context. Like Radwan said, I've been writing on Tunisia for 11 years. I was in Tunis in July and August, and I went back in January and interviewed, between those two recent trips, over 100 different Tunisians across the ideological spectrum. And I noticed a real, almost evangelical enthusiasm for Kais Saied when he first came to power in the summer. Despite the fact that he had immediately shuttered parliament, closed it unconstitutionally, putting military tanks at the gates, despite the fact that he had, for months, referred to his opponents with such demonizing language as microbes, traitors, even calling his opponents demons and viruses, there was a lot of confidence that Kais Saied, as an uncorrupted former law professor, a seemingly clean, upright man, not a sort of money-grubbing, golden toilet-loving autocrat to be, would somehow swoop in and rectify the manifold failures of Tunisia's kind of paralytically inept in some ways parliaments that had come before throughout the transition, and fix the economic grievances that so many Tunisians cared about. I spoke with one woman, I chronicled this experience in a long, deep dive into the state of Tunisia's opposition that I published last week with Dawn, which you guys can read if any of you are interested. I spoke with one woman in a very shabby, popular neighborhood of the capital, Tunis, who had even said to me, really tragically, touchingly in the summer, she said, I believe that Kais Saied is going to be the person to finally pull these terrible, brutal police officers off my son's backs, even though he'd said and done nothing in his 2 years in office to make her think that he was going to undertake these important reforms to the security sector and the economy. It was interesting, though, when I went back to Tunis last month and interviewed a few dozen Tunisians, including some who had really expressed a lot of support in the summer, like this woman. The edge of their enthusiasm had seemed to be taken off. Their enthusiasm was a lot more muted. They seemed a bit confused. A lot of them said, well, if it's a binary choice between just what came before and him, I don't know. I still don't like what came before. I don't trust those people. I don't really know if there's a good alternative, but there's no clarity. nothing's clear. I'm just amazed that he hasn't done more right now. Nothing changes. These sorts of messages were coming through. We've certainly seen, as the two speakers who went before me emphasized, just a systematic assault on everything that Tunisia's revolution and all of the painstaking efforts that came out of it built, from Kais Saied since July 25th. He closed parliament with military tanks. He suspended Tunisia's constitution. He tried to set himself up as the sole prosecutor. There are lots of well-sourced reports of him trying to do just completely absurd things, like install military governors of every governorate in Tunisia, or simply fire all the governors. He's continued to refer to his opponents as traitors, microbes, demons, and viruses. Immediately upon seizing power in his presidential coup of July 25th, he imposed sweeping travel bans on entire swaths of Tunisian society, like business people, and like every single elected parliamentarian, regardless of their political party, even members of parties that supported him since 2011. It's just really extraordinary. He's evinced almost a talent for isolating potential allies. He has shown zero interest in dialoguing with anyone, including Tunisia's very strong labor union, UGTT, which is really make or break for him, could be at least. Although he's engaged in some conversation with them recently, he's shown no inclination to do actual dialogue with them, and they were quite positive about him in the beginning. Same with parties that were positive about him, like Harakat al-Shab or At-Tayyar. So he's lost a lot of goodwill in Tunisia's, amongst Tunisia's political parties and parts of its civil society. Basically every political party in the country now, with the exception of a small Nasserist party called Harakat al-Shab and very, very tiny party called Watar, extraordinarily marginal, now refers to the events of July 25th as a coup. And that's an extremely important rhetorical shift, because whether or not July 25th constituted a coup was a matter of intense debate amongst Tunisians and human rights defenders and democracy fighters immediately after his actions on July 25th. So that's very important. However, as I detailed in this piece published last week, Tunisia's opposition remains weak and incredibly fragmented. I outlined three main groups that the opposition falls into. First, citizens against the coup, and the dominant parties in Tunisia's former, now frozen parliament, and Ennahda, called Tunis, and Karama, are supporting the quickest path back to some sort of constitutionality in Tunisia. They're supporting a plan that would bring back the elected parliament for even a very short period of time, maybe even weeks or days, just so that Parliament, which is the constitutional authority vested with this power, could organize new elections, and you could have fresh, free, and fair elections. That's the exit ramp that would most swiftly restore Tunisia to some form of constitutionalism. But not all the opposition is behind it. The second group of opposition, I call them the both ands. They're both against Kais, against what they're now referring to as his coup, but they're also against the 10 years of inept rule that came before, and they're especially against Ennahda. So there's a kind of false equivalence that I would argue that they're engaging in, where, in a single breath, they're against Kais, who is the first order problem, but they're also expressing a lot of opposition to Ennahda and what came before, which I think, given where Tunisia sits right now, is by far and away a second order problem. So they don't want to work with citizens against the coup, the first group, because they see it as too close to Ennahda, etc. The third group, I would basically call them the ones who are still waiting for Kais's phone call. They would probably endorse him or even ally with him if he would actually pick up the phone and engage him in a way that he hasn't yet. And I'd put the labor union in there, UGTT, and a number of other civil society groups, sadly, including the ones who mediated Tunisia's 2015 Nobel Peace Prize winning quartet dialogue. Stunningly, given the situation that you've all heard about tonight, the international community, i.e. Western democracies, have been mystifyingly credulous in their responses to Sayed. On December 13th, Kais Saied announced a roadmap. I'm problematizing it with quotation marks here because I don't think it merits the term roadmap. If it's a roadmap to anything, it's a roadmap to a consolidated dictatorship in Tunisia, because the entire thing exists outside any framework of rule of law or constitutionalism, and would impose a very unfree and unfair plebiscite on the country that would push forward an autocratic vision that he has of Tunisia's constitution and political system. But when he made this announcement on December 13th, the U.S. State Department released a statement that, like I said, was just, mystifyingly positive almost. It sounded, they were just incredibly relieved that Sayed had come up with any sort of roadmap whatsoever, whether or not it was a roadmap towards consolidating his own dictatorship in Tunisia. We heard over the past week a flurry of statements, including from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Relations Committee, the U.S. State Department, the United Nations, various European Union governments of concern. Once they realized that Sayed was shutting down the High Judicial Council, which is the last remaining safeguard of any form of judicial independence in the country. I think it's a bit too little too late, but at least you finally heard some Western governments appearing to wake up to the absolute gravity of what's at stake here. However, I think Western governments' interests in working with Kais Saied in the short-term pursuit of seeming stabilization are very strong. And if he throws them any kind of a bone here, maybe even if he doesn't, they're likely to move forward with an IMF package and continued support. It would be absolutely, I think, indefensible in the current situation for things like the MCC package of aid, which is a package of aid from the United States earmarked for democracies, to be unpaused in this situation. Kais Saied, I think, is making it very difficult for anyone not to understand that Tunisia is now in a dictatorship. But we see Western governments, I think, still very unclear about their position. And I'll conclude with this. This is a man who has been, despite the fact that he was a constitutional lawyer, fixated on presidentialism for a long time. I've interviewed former colleagues and students of his who have told me that, he taught one class for 20 years and he basically never changed the syllabus. His syllabus for intro to constitutional law came from professors that he had in the 1960s. And it also evinced a real fixation on a misunderstanding of American presidentialism. He had basically 3/4 of the course, about presidentialism, and a very, very small unit on parliamentarism. He sees himself messianically as a savior figure. And he has been systematically unraveling every piece of institutional democratic fabric that it took a once in a lifetime, maybe once in a century or more than one century's revolution, and years of laborious, difficult, painstaking labor and inclusive dialogue after the revolution to build. If Kais Saied disappeared today, it would still take years to re-knit what he has unraveled. So Tunisia is in a very dark place. I think the question right now is not if Tunisia is a dictatorship, because it technically has been since July 25th, tragically, because there's been one man ruling unchecked via unilateral personal decrees. The question instead, in my view, is whether Kais Saied can consolidate his dictatorship. And the answer lies in Tunisia's opposition. Can it unite? And in the international community, can they evaluate the risks and respond? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. So now we go to questions and answers. So I have a question from Lucille Maybon. the question is, hello, I would like to know what kind of tools would allow to act on this situation at the different levels, institutions, civil society, justice, international justice. What are the role, or what is the role of NGOs in the situation? And related to that also, my question is, how can the judiciary system fix itself? The problem is there are a lot of Tunisians who are under the impression there is a lot of corruption within the judicial system, and that's what the president is using to justify his shutting down or closing down the Judicial Council. But how can we put pressure to reform the judicial system while it is independent of any other executive or legislative branch? So those are the two questions. Maybe we start with Mr. Saeed.
Sure, thanks, Radwan. So just answer the question about how the judiciary can reform itself and answers the accusations of corruption. I think there was also another question, questions and answers about delays in certain investigations. For the judiciary must be independent, but it must also be accountable. You ensure accountability through a disciplinary system. Judges are subject to a disciplinary system. If the judge is responsible for misconduct, and misconduct is clearly defined by the law, the Higher Judicial Council is working on a code of ethics, hasn't been adopted yet, but just based on the law, if the judge is responsible for judicial misconduct, that judge can be removed from the office in cases of serious misconduct, or can be subject to other disciplinary sanctions, including suspension. So the procedure, it exists. There are two elements that are important to highlight. When it comes to any citizens, including the attendees that are asking questions about certain delays in certain cases, etc., they can bring a complaint before the Judicial Inspection Service. The Judicial Inspection Service is under the authority of the Ministry of Justice, is under the authority of the executive branch. If you have any concerns, complaints about judicial misconduct, you bring it to the Judicial Inspection Service. The Inspection Service investigates, and if the allegations are founded and there is enough grounds for misconduct, then you bring it to the Higher Judicial Council. So when you complain about the Higher Judicial Council not doing enough, we have to understand that the Higher Judicial Council is not the body in charge of the investigation. It's the Ministry of Justice so far and the Judicial Inspection Service who are in charge of conducting such investigations and assessing whether there are reasonable grounds to initiate disciplinary proceedings. That's one element, and I think it's important while we are thinking about the accountability of the judicial system to highlight and to insist that the Higher Judicial Council does not have all the authorities or all the powers, and it's not in charge of the Judicial Inspection Service, for example. You reform the judiciary as well through the laws that govern the judiciary. The Constitution provides for a law on the reform of the military justice system to limit the jurisdiction of military courts to strictly military offenses. Had that law been applied that were there since 2014, for example, Mr. Kilani is subject to military prosecution just because he expressed his opinion. So that law was not adopted. That's the responsibility of the parliament. That's the responsibility of the government. There is a law on statute for judges that was also provided for by the Constitution. 7 years after the adoption of the Constitution, or 8 years, that law was not adopted. And because the law on the statute for judges was not adopted, what we have so far is the law of 67 that governs the whole aspect of the management of the career of judges, and that would effectively give the president, if he is to enforce his plan of dissolving the Higher Judicial Council and appointing a new Judicial Council or a new body that's under his control, to dismiss judges, like to remove them from the office. There is no such a thing as security of tenure for Tunisian judges. They are considered as civil servants, and they can be terminated by the executive if you don't have that guarantee through the Higher Judicial Council. And the third element about the delays, and I think it's important. I think it's a legitimate question that was asked about delays in specific case of Shukri Belaid and Fahimi and others. And here again, it is important just in relation to the Higher Judicial Council, because that's the topic of our discussion today, to clearly tell everyone that it is not the responsibility of the Higher Judicial Council to conduct criminal investigations. That's not what the Higher Judicial Council is for. And if the President is really concerned about delays in judicial proceedings, the President has the financial means to increase the number of judges, to increase the number of prosecutors, to increase the number of security or law enforcement officers who can conduct such investigations and who can ensure that there is no prolonged judicial proceeding as they are, and also to, in terms of the reform of the Code of Criminal Procedure and making criminal proceedings less complicated and less prolonged. The role of the civil society organization, I think it's important, at least in the context of Tunisia, to highlight the significant, important role that was played in the past by by the Professional Association of Judges, particular the Association of Tunisian Magistrates, and that is today leading also the fight and the pushback against the president's decision. So it's important for this judicial Professional Association of Judges, together with civil society organization, together with the Bar Association. I just wanted to insist that when it comes to the rule of law and when it comes to human rights in a country, when it comes to the separation of power, the primacy of the Constitution, the respect of constitutional challenge and legal procedures, the Bar Association must be independent. Those representing the Bar Association must act independently and in defense of the rule of law, not to implement some political agenda. And that kind of coordination between civil society organizations, between Bar Association, Professional Association of Judges, and other stakeholders, that might help or contribute to ensuring that such systematic dismantling of the rule of law in Tunisia is not being brought to and that the president is hoping for, and that both the Constitution, the Parliament, and the Higher Judicial Council are reinstated.
سي عبد الرزاق عندك إجابات على الأسئلة؟
نحب نعلق على
I want to comment on Mr. Ben Arabiya, and I want to greet him and Ms. Monica regarding the position of lawyers. The position of the head of the Bar Association, in fact, does not represent all lawyers, because lawyers did not give him the authority to agree with the head of the Coup to accept the dissolution of the Supreme Judicial Council. I don't think this is part of his powers approved by all lawyers, at least from a democratic point of view. And I said this today on the radio. I said that the head of the Bar Association should invite all lawyers to an exceptional general meeting and discuss the matter, because this is a very important question, and our role as lawyers, everyone knows that according to Article 105 of the Constitution and the Lawyers' Charter, lawyers are part of the justice system. This is not just a matter for the judiciary. The head of the Bar Association should have called lawyers to an extraordinary meeting to discuss such an important matter. As Mr. Ben Arabiya said, perhaps there might be political implication by the head of the Lawyers' Bar Association. I do not know how far he is implicated in this relationship with the Coup, but his position does not represent the history of the law profession or the the lawyers' charter, and he has not been faithful to the struggle of lawyers for democracy and freedom, and of which the independence of the judiciary is an important pillar. This is in relation to the question of the role of the position of the president of the Bar Association. Of course, today, public opinion, we have seen that at the beginning, on the 25th of July, when the coup happened. Since that time, there has been a great change in the position in public opinion. Today, we find, particularly in the educated elite, they have understood that the head of the coup authority is leading the country to the unknown, because today our country is almost collapsing. There is chaos in the legal and institutional aspect. Some institutions, we are surprised that he could abolish, for instance, the commission to assess the constitutionality of laws, or the anti-corruption commission. Why were these dissolved? This is someone who wants to dismantle the state. He is in the process of dismantling the state and its institutions in order to take it, to drag it into the unknown. And we must, all patriots, all free people in Tunisia must stand against this grave danger, because today the head of the coup authority is the imminent and real danger, and the Tunisian people will wake up, at least part, those who were deceived by the discourse of his popular discourse of the coup authority, which, it must be said, has brought him a certain popularity and incomprehensible popularity. And of course, this, as I said, his reality will be exposed through the result of where he has taken the country. I believe that we must save the country before it is too late, and I hope that the active forces in Tunisia will wake up and stand against this danger which threatens every day the foundations of the nation and of the state.
Monica,
thank you, Mr. Abdelrazak.
Where is the civil society in Tunisia? We've all been so proud of the civil society in Tunisia in the last 10 years. And then after July 25, it's been silent, but mostly, silent, and has not been really active. What's going on in the civil society sector?
So in that piece I referred to last week in Dawn, I said that Tunisian civil society is split between the second camp, the both ands, we're both against Qais's coup and we're against the 10 years that came before in Ennahda, and we don't want to work with Ennahda, and the third camp, waiting for the presidential pain. The legacy civil society institutions, most importantly UGTT, Tunisia's famous, powerful trade union, and the 2015 Nobel Quartet Peace Prize winning actors, like the Bar Association, sadly, which Abdelrazak Kilani just referred to and explains, most of them are actually in the third camp, more or less waiting for the presidential ping, less against the what, or the end goals, i.e. less against Qais holding all the reins of power in his own hands, and more against the how, or the approach, i.e., we're okay if you exclude Ennahda a bit. We don't like them anyway. But please don't exclude us. Please include us in some kind of dialogue. Please invite us to the table. And that's really notable and sad, because the mobilizational power in Tunisian civil society, it comes from UGTT, right? UGTT has the mobilizational potential. Newer civil society organizations, ones that were created after the revolution, I think have been more likely to be in the second camp of the both ands. But there's a lot of disorientation and disagreement happening even within some of those. Even within, for example, Bausala or iWatch. iWatch, at least in its leaders' statements in Arabic on social media, on their own personal accounts, were quite, enthusiastic or sympathetic to elements of what Sayed did on July 25th. So there's a lot of splits within Tunisian civil society. They're mostly in the second and third camps, though. It's worth noting, though, that this newly created organization, Citizens Against the Coup, is a civil society organization, and it's in the first camp. It's wanting to bring back parliament as swiftly as possible so that it can organize free and fair elections. The leadership of Citizens Against the Coup is comprised of 11 people who include former leftists, like Jawhar bin Barak and his father, Ezzeddin Hazgi. Now, Hazgi was imprisoned and tortured as a leftist under Bourguiba for 6 years. It also includes Destorians, other pro-revolutionary tendencies. It doesn't include a single member of Ennahda, though, and that's by design, because they don't want to be cursed with the reverse Midas touch of Ennahda, the toxifying Midas touch of Ennahda, although that's happening anyway. Sadly, and if you talk to some of that leadership, like Hazgi, who was tortured as a leftist under Bourguiba, he'll say, this divide and rule strategy that our dictators have had in Tunisia, trying to split the so-called Islamists against secularists, leftists, against other tendencies, has really empowered them for so long in our history. And wouldn't that be tragic if it allows Kayis to consolidate his dictatorship now? And some of those leaders and Citizens Against the Coup even went on hunger strike in December and January. So they're very passionate. But most of Tunisian civil society is in camps 2 and 3. I would say that what Kayis did on July 25th split Tunisia's post-revolutionary civil society as never before. And a lot of them are really having intense internal disagreements about what route they should take.
Thank you, Monica. I have 4 more questions. I'm going to read them very quickly, and then we have about 7 minutes left to try to answer these questions and this panel. So the first question from Abdullah Janahi. Thank you to all the panelists for a very thorough and clear presentation. My question references one of Mr. Kilani's comments around counter-revolutionary forces. Despite economic woes, Tunisia until recently was considered the Arab world's democratic success. How fearful are these counter-revolutionary regimes about the export of democracy throughout the region? And to what extent is their paranoia grounded in reality? Is Sayed their way out? So that's the first question. Then we have 2 questions from Lamis Al-Muhtasib. So first question is, where is Ennahda from all of this? Any remaining influence or no popularity? What happened to Ennahda's popularity, I guess, is the question. And then same for the international community, which is effectively acting as a complicit in this coup. Maybe it knows more than the Tunisians know, or maybe it is part of the coup. Then we have a question from Anne Moisan. Does the West's reaction to what is happening in Tunisia portend a dramatic shift to supporting stability versus true democratic reforms and progress in the region? And the last question, which we just received from Marco Toma, Egypt, Libya, Syria, etc., failure of Arab. Tunisia remains the democratic lab for MENA region, for MENA democracy again, now. So I guess the question is Tunisia still a democratic lab for democracy in the region again? So we have 5 questions. Please, each one take 2 minutes to try to answer these questions as quickly as you can. Mr. Said?
Sure, thanks, Ridwan. There was a question about corruption again. Is this something of the past or is this something new? I think people don't have trust on the judiciary because for decades under the Ben Ali regime, the judiciary was subordinated to the executive. Did the transitional authorities and the institutions that were established after the revolution did enough to change that narrative? Of course, the response is no, because there are still delays, because there are still cases that have been opened. I just give one concrete example. There is a transitional justice process in Tunisia, 200 cases that were referred by the Truth Commission to the specialized chambers. Specialized chambers have been working for 3 years, almost 3 years now, with cases that were referred with the names of the accused, with the evidence, and yet we still don't have one judgment from these specialized chambers. So this is the broader context. Of course, that this corruption existed before. What the Tunisians are asking about right now is a justice that is more that avoids this kind of prolonged procedures. And I think it's just consistent with international law and standards that justice delayed is justice denied, and that's to respond to that. It's the responsibility of all authorities, not only the higher judicial council. So that's one. Two, about countries in the region that are pushing against the democratic project and in relation to the international community. And Tunisia, I think, is one of the questions is right about how this is a unique case in the Arab world. I heard a lot of criticism of Tunisian Constitution of 2014, but of all the constitutions that we had in the Arab world, all over the years, like for decades and decades, this is the constitution that was adopted following an open democratic process, a constituent assembly that was elected democratically, a transparent process, an inclusive process that lasted for 3 years, and that resulted in a constitution that maybe is not perfect, but it's the result of a comprehensive, inclusive, transparent, legitimate process, not some kind of consultations over social media platforms or what is being proposed right now. And it's important to insist on that for the international community, for them to engage with this process and to choose stability over the rule of law, to choose what they call stability over the rule of law and over human rights. Tunisia is a democracy. If the president orders his security services to be removed from before the High Judicial Council and from the offices or the headquarters of the parliament, and if the parliament is to be reinstated and the High Judicial Council to be reinstated and the constitution to be reinstated, then you have a democracy in Tunisia. The only obstacle to democracy right now in Tunisia is what the president is doing, and the security and military forces are giving effect to his decision. So instead of engaging of a new process or a new roadmap or whatever process that the international community is asking for right now, they can ask for a simple question. One, for the constitution, the parliament, the higher judicial council to be reinstated, and for the democratic process to resume, and for the Tunisian authorities to continue the building of their democracy. Because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of laws, a lot of institutions that were provided for by the constitution that were not established. Had we had the constitutional court, maybe the outcome would have been different right now. Not sure at 100% because the president believes that he has the power to suspend the constitution by decree, so he could easily have had suspended the constitutional court as well. But still, that's the process, and all the foundations are there, and it's important for the international community to talk with a unified voice in terms of reinstating constitution, parliament, and the higher judicial council.
Thank you very much, Mr. سعيد. سي عبد الرزاق تفضل، عندك الكلمة.
الكلمة يعني تونس بالنسبة
Tunisia,
للمنطقة تشكل مشكل يعني
for the region, poses a problem for some neighbors,
جيران العرب
Arab neighbors, who are not pleased with this democratic pioneering model, and also at the same time to other neighbors, because Tunisia occupies a strategic position in the Mediterranean, and I believe that Tunisia's stability and security concerns neighbors on the other shore of the Mediterranean. On this basis, I say that Tunisia should be helped because there are counter-revolutionary movements and forces that are fed by these regimes, by some Gulf and Arab regimes. These movements do not represent a popular force, but represent a power in terms of media presence or financial power. There is a movement, a strong movement in this direction, and of course, in this conflict, the question of political Islam occupies the Brotherhood is always the problem that obstructs any progress for Tunisia. The so-called Brotherhood, Islamists, and however, Islamists in Tunisia, as represented by Ennahda, objectively, they have proven that they are a democratic party, and their experience through their participation in government over the last 10 years, we did not hear that Ennahda any day in terms of the constitution or the laws wanted to violate these or the rules of the democratic game, but they respected them, and on this basis the elite, the intellectual elite in Tunisia must take this part of Tunisian society that is represented by Ennahda. They should involve them in society and integrate them in society. They are part of the Tunisian society, and no one should accept this exclusionary discourse. And we know that there is a political party that is promoting this exclusionary discourse. Tunisia cannot advance with exclusion. There should be coexistence between Tunisians. They should build their democracy in the framework of brotherhood, and particularly respect for the law and institutions, and respect for the constitution, this constitution that guarantees freedom of conscience and belief, and it should be the criteria, it should be the social contract that should rule any difference between the various political parties. In fact, I am optimistic. I believe we have conscious elite and conscious people that will not accept to go back to dictatorship and democracy. The will of the people will triumph in restoring freedom and democracy. Thank you, Mr. Kilani, and thank you particularly for this optimist note, because we all need some optimism, and we hope the future will be better than our present.
Last words and maybe a few comments about these questions.
Sure. To answer Lamas's question, so where is Ennahda in all of this? 3 exclamation points. I think it's important to first say that to make one's response to what's happening since July 25th a referendum on Ennahda, on whether Ennahda has been good or bad for Tunisia is to engage in the most dangerous kind of whataboutism. Ennahda has participated now in 3 free and fair elections. It's respected the results of all of those elections. It's also voluntarily given up power in a variety of non-electoral contexts over the past 10 years when it didn't actually have to, because it's strategically self-interested, it wants to survive, but also because Ennahda reasoned, even well before the 2011 revolution, that democracy was in its best interests, right? Because dictatorship didn't go so well for Ennahda. You know, there was torture, horrible torture, there was political exile. You know, it wasn't a good experience for them. It's also important to point out that Ennahda has lost vote share consistently in each of Tunisia's 3 elections. It was even beaten in the second one of those elections by a so-called secular anti-Ennahda, so-called anti-Islamist party, Nida Tunis. So, you know, this gets now to Abdullah's question about whether the paranoia regarding Ennahda and the so-called Islamist problem from some Arab regimes is founded. And I would say no, it's not. Ennahda can be beaten democratically. It has been beaten. They respect the outcomes of elections. And even next door Algeria, which has had its own storied problems with Islamists, made its peace with Ennahda having a measure of the vote share in Tunisia after the revolution, which tells you a lot, I think. Algeria understood that Ennahda wasn't going to be a threat to them. This obsession with Ennahda and viewing Ennahda as just an undifferentiated franchise in this broader regional Muslim Brotherhood Ikhwan outfit fundamentally misunderstands the history of Ennahda. It's really, really different in some key ways from the Egyptian Ikhwan or Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. You know, I did my whole PhD on this topic. I'll just throw out one of the ways. They weren't founded by one person. They didn't have a pyramidal top-down structure from the beginning. They endeavored to have some internal forms of checks and balances and vibrant debate even from the beginning. And they included women from the beginning. There wasn't a separate qism or separate division for women. Now that's completely different than the way that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928. You know, the list goes on and on and on. In Ennahda's first press conference in 1981, they said that they would be happy to work with communists or anybody who was going to ally with them against Bourguiba's dictatorship. And a lot of other Islamists or Ikhwanis in the region were looking at them saying, "What? You call yourself Islamist and you're going to work with the communists? What?" You know, so this is not to exonerate Ennahda. Ennahda has made many, many mistakes over time, but it is to say that this kind of paranoia, single-minded focus or obsession on Ennahda, or, you know, this kind of both-andism right now, given the gravity of the current situation, given that Kais Saied has all the power and that Ennahda is only polling around 10-15%. If there were elections tomorrow and Kais Saied simply abided by the democratic rules of the game and created his own party, he would absolutely kill Ennahda in those elections. So, you know, it's just an unfounded obsession that really, really plays into Kais's hand, and Tunisia has a long history of that with its dictators. Is the international community part of the coup? Not to my knowledge. But is it complicit? No. Now that's a more interesting debate, because some of these muted, mystifyingly credulous reactions certainly do help enable Kais. So, you know, I think what happened this past week with Kais shutting down the High Judicial Council is really a speak now or forever hold your peace moment regarding Tunisian democracy. One might hope that Western countries, including the United States, would invest as much effort in trying to help Tunisia's democracy as they invest in complaining about how there's no democracy in the Arab world. You know, Tunisia is the first organically created democracy in the region, the only form of representative accountable government in the region. You know, it's just a bit mystifying. But this now takes me to Anne's question. Does the West's reaction represent a dramatic shift to supporting stability over democratic reform and progress? No, it doesn't. You know, there have been decades of scholarship on the international relations of the Maghreb that demonstrates that Western actors, most importantly Europe, France, but also the United States, at the end of the day have tended to care about two things: preventing migration from North Africa and preventing terrorism. And if they believe that a local dictator can give them that, they'll work along. Now, the question for Caius is, can he make them believe that? You know, I think in the short term, a lot of them want to believe it, you know, because they have so many other fish to fry internationally with foreign policy problems, you know, Russia, Libya, Yemen, and they just want him to throw them some kind of a bone so they can move forward with the stabilization idea. But I think in the longer term, they're going to see, you know, like some Arab governments in the region who've, you know, soft-pedaled him a little bit too, that he's an agent of chaos. This is not your garden variety dictator. Caius has an ideological commitment to a very strange radical revamping of Tunisia's political system that looks like an hourglass. It's a Gaddafi-esque, Jamahiriya-esque system that has so-called very direct, healthy, rich democracy at the bottom level and a strong president, and then nothing in between. No civil society organization, no political parties, nothing in between. But it doesn't play out that way. You know, like it didn't play out that way in Gaddafi's Jamahiriya state in Libya. It's not going to play out that way in Tunisia. It's going to probably produce a lot of chaos. He doesn't have any economic plan. He doesn't want to dialogue with anybody. Whenever he gets on the phone with you know, American officials, he just wants to lecture them about obscure legislative history from the United States, you know, etc. Is Tunisia still a democratic laboratory? No, it's not. It's now a laboratory for de-democratization.
Thank you, Monica, for those less optimistic remarks. But we live in dire times. We live in very dangerous times for our nascent democracy in Tunisia. But I think this was a really wonderful panel. Very important points and excellent presentations. Also very good questions from our audience. So I want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and let's pray that Tunisia will re-establish itself as a democracy. I personally am very optimistic. I feel that the Tunisian people who have tasted freedom in the last 10 years, they also tasted poverty, to be frank, especially in the last 2 years. You know, the last 2 years of the pandemic have been very painful. And so, but in general, they're not going to give up on freedom. I think they will be very much attached to freedom and democracy. And they will know that there is no freedom and democracy without a constitution that respects freedom and democracy, without institutions independent of each other, without checks and balances, that if we put all the powers within the hand of one man, whoever that man is, then we have lost everything. And that we cannot talk about democracy, we cannot talk about freedoms when there is one man who can decide everything and fire judges whenever they disagree with him, fire ministers whenever they disagree with him, close down the parliament whenever they disagree with him. That is a recipe for disaster and a recipe for one of the worst dictatorships that can exist on the face of the earth. I don't think the Tunisians will accept that. I think the Tunisians will continue to fight for a return to freedom and democracy, a rule of law and constitution. With that, thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you, inshallah, soon in free and democratic Tunisia. Thank you.
So much.